Our guest today is Alexander Libman, and I've got a kind of difficult choice here. I could read all of his publications, which would probably take the hour that we have for him to talk, or allow him to talk. But he is currently at least 4 places. He has the Germany Identification Frankfurt School of Finance and Management. He's an assistant professor. He's also affiliated with what is still the Academy of Sciences in Moscow, also the School of Economics at Moscow University, East China Normal University, and the private University of Applied Science in Georgetown. How you managed to be in 5 places at once, hard to imagine. If you have not seen them, these 2 volumes, Eurasian Integration, Challenge of Transcontinental Regionalism, and Holding Together Regionalism, 20 Years of Post-Soviet Integration, are 2 of the best summaries you'll find in English for current regional issues in Eurasia. And we are delighted to have him.
Thank you very much. It is indeed a great pleasure to be here today and to talk particularly about this project, which is very much work in progress and which is changing all the time. So I would really be very grateful for any comments, any suggestions, and any criticisms you would have. So what is this project about? This project is with Evgeny Vinokurov from St. Petersburg. We're trying to understand how political regimes affected the likelihood of economic cooperation in Eurasia. And just to give you a background, economic cooperation, or discussion about economic cooperation, regional economic integration in Eurasia, was going on from the day Soviet Union collapsed, and basically until recently followed a very standard and repeated pattern. The countries met, signed a new agreement, made large statements about moving to a customs union, free trade area, economic union, common currency, went home and nothing happened. And a year later they met again and signed the new agreements, very often with the same name. So there were at least 4 free trade areas in the CIS, there were 2 customs unions, and then again nothing happened. And in fact, there are many explanations for that, but one of which has been very often discussed and one which has been very often suggested is it may have something to do with the nature of political regimes of these countries. Most of post-Soviet countries are either autocratic, either consolidated autocracies, or hybrid regimes at best with very strong autocratic tendencies. And we have a large literature, I will come to that just in a second, which tells us non-democracies or autocracies should be less likely to really cooperate. So what this project tries to do is to understand how can it be that under certain conditions autocracies actually cooperate, and cooperation will mean here compliance with the economic agreements they sign. And the background for this question was the, until recently, relatively successful in some sense, customs union, which was set up in 2010, and which is the first functioning regional agreement in the post-Soviet space. And more generally, this question is, of course, not just related to the post-Soviet countries. It is something what is relevant for many non-democratic countries, and I will talk about that more when the time comes. So, as I said, the evidence that non-democracies are unlikely to cooperate with each other in any form is relatively abundant. You can trace it back from the democratic peace theories, which actually told us that non-democracies should be more likely to go to war to each other. But if you think about actual argument why it should happen, the literature typically highlights 2 problems autocracies have. The first one is credibility of commitments. Once you sign an international agreement, it makes sense for you to comply only if everybody complies. And if you expect that your partner will not comply, you will not comply in the first place. And with non-democracies, you can never be sure whether they're going to comply or not. Because they're relatively unconstrained domestically, there are fewer veto players, they are not subject to the pressure of the public, which is allowing them to manipulate the agreements as they want. So that's the problem number 1. The problem number 2, even before you sign an agreement, as a non-democratic country, you are typically much less willing to actually restrict your power in any form. Why? Well, because for many non-democracies, having absolute control over any economic, any political decision is the key of how they survive. In fact, this is one of the explanations from another literature why non-democracies are, if they are manipulating elections, manipulating them into excessive numbers. So you don't just get 50% plus one vote and have your results. You want to have 90%. It doesn't work otherwise. And there is an excellent book coming out by Simser from Chicago University, who is claiming they do it as a signal to their own bureaucracy. We are in control, so you should to comply with what we are doing. And this is one of the reasons why signing any international agreement, or rather signing may work, but complying with any international agreement, which will actually put them into a situation when the decision will be not up to them, is a problem. And in fact, empirical evidence is very rich. And many papers which looked at international samples argue that the non-democracies are less likely to cooperate. On the other hand, some studies which looked at particular regions where democratic regimes are unstable or actually absent, this Rammer paper about Mercosur is a good example, find a much more difficult pattern. And this is precisely what we want to do. In this paper, we want to critically examine under which conditions autocracies may like to cooperate. And specifically, we will look at the following setting, which makes sense if you think about post-Soviet space, but not just about post-Soviet space. So imagine at a certain point of time, autocratic countries did sign an economic agreement, from free trade area to however ambitious it could look like. Why did they sign it? That's an important and different question here. It may have happened because of exogenous shocks. For example, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, something had to be signed because you had to deal with immediate challenges of fragmentation of this space. Or they may have signed it because of domestic considerations. In post-Soviet countries, signing a new agreement with Russia was, for many of these regimes, a very helpful tool to get an argument against the opposition. Belarus is a very well-known phenomenon here. We could talk about that later in the questions and answers, maybe. But anyway, they signed the agreement. And now they have a choice whether they are going to actually comply with what they signed, or they will just let it be on paper. And the question is, are they actually going to comply? And in order to understand whether they're going to comply or not, and how their decision to comply may be different from decision to democracies to comply, and mind you, zombie agreements, Gray calls them agreements where you sign something and then don't do it, are not typical only for autocracies. Democracies have it as well. But still, so what could they think about? And probably the first two issues which you would take into account is, if you have signed an agreement, complying with that can be seen as a source of private benefits and of public goods. The public good argument is rather straightforward. If you have intense economic cooperation, removing custom borders, for example, or creating a joint decision mechanism, maybe creating positive externalities for everybody. Private good is again clear. If you are, as an autocrat, owning a company which requires access to pipelines abroad, that's very good for you to sign an agreement and actually comply with that, because then you have direct profits from it. On the other hand, you have obviously costs of implementation. So signing agreements is very cheap. Actually, the only cost you have is maybe to celebrate the signing of agreements. And in fact, I will talk about Russia-Belarus case. Very often, this was the main point of debate which countries had, how to celebrate what we are doing now. But once you start implementing them, it becomes costly. And finally, the fourth point, which is here, which you'll see, is obviously exit costs. Once you start complying with the agreement, contrary to just signing it, you may increase your costs of breaking away at some point of time. So how large are the costs? How large are what they're going to do? And if you think about these parameters and think about how the autocracy should behave, particularly contrary to democracies, two things would probably stand out. One of them, and this is back to a very good paper by Bader and co-author in Contemporary Politics, published very recently, autocracies are much more likely to focus on private goods than on public goods. For obvious reasons, they have lower demand to satisfy the population, or they just could be more rent-seeking in making their decisions. The second problem is they have much higher risks of losing power. If you stop being president in the US, you go on and write memoirs or lecture at the university, and anyway, you lead a good life. But even the case of Yanukovych, who was just autocrat to be, he didn't manage to get there, tells us that the risks are here quite high. So based on these two differences, we try to look at the cases of autocracy agreements. And we will specifically try to explain the variation by just one parameter, which is economic dependence or economic interdependence. Economic dependence is here broadly understood as how much trade migration, FDI ties with the partner contribute to your economic performance. And in extreme case, it may be the fact that you can't get any economic performance without these trade ties. Let me give you just one example from the post-Soviet space, which will probably explain some of the motives of the players in our game. You may know Russian cotton industry heavily depends on cotton, from Russian textiles, heavily depend on cotton supply from Uzbekistan. But the thing is, Russian textiles depend on cotton supply from Uzbekistan so much because the length of the fiber of the cotton Russian machinery can process is met only by the cotton which is grown in Uzbekistan. By the way, vice versa, it's also true. Uzbekistani cotton can be sold only to Russia because it's the only place where the length of the fiber fits. So that's an extreme dependence. If you go to Ivanovo, which is the Russian region where most of the textiles are located, they simply have no choice. Either they need to build the entire equipment from scratch, or they trade with Uzbekistan. And Uzbekistan, to some extent, also has lower choices, though it managed to diversify from cotton trade. This is the extreme case of interdependence. And then it goes down until the situation when basically you can cut off any ties to your trade partner without any substantial costs. So this is our main explanatory variable. And we will look at three outcomes: low, intermediate, and high economic interdependence. So let's start with low economic independence or dependence. Here things are very easy. Gains which you could get from private or public goods are very low. Costs of implementation are very likely very high, or at least higher than the gains you could get. So you are not going to implement the agreement. It's true for democracies, and it's true for autocracies. It's more costly to comply than anything you could get from it, at least in the short term. It may be different if you have expectations of long-term gains, but there should be some high certainty about these gains happening in the future. And if the certainty is absent, well, then you still are not going to comply. There are two exceptions, and these two exceptions will go throughout the whole presentation. One exception is if the stronger partner just forces the weaker partner to comply. It may be economic pressure, any force tool which comes to your mind. Then, of course, this entire logic is not applicable. Another case is if one of the countries is extremely weak politically, domestically, they may be searching for a foreign partner as a patron, protecting it from possibly domestic opposition. The case in the post-Soviet space, which I will mention now and probably not talk about future, is Tajikistan, which was extremely eager to comply with all the agreements it signed, for the simple reason that the country, for at least a decade of its post-Civil War existence, very much depended on Russian support domestically. So these are two exceptions. These are actually two boring exceptions, because we could guess that then compliance happens from the beginning. And the interesting cases are happening here. So low dependence, as you would guess, no compliance for democracies and non-democracies alike. High dependence. Here things actually are different. If you are a democracy, then first thing you should see is that you have very large gains in terms of private, but what's more important, public goods. If there is a lot of economic interdependence between these countries, then by facilitating trade or FDI or creating common institutional infrastructure, you provide a lot to the participants. So this creates a very strong advantage for you to cooperate. On the other hand, for high dependence case, exit costs are also enormous. In fact, by signing the agreement, you cement the ties which you have today and prevent yourself from seeking other ties with other countries, other partners. And if this happens, then of course you may encounter high costs in the future if your partner is manipulating. Randall Stone has a very good book exactly on this topic. And autocracies are, of course, very likely to manipulate because, going back to what we said in the beginning, they have low credibility. There is no guarantee that once you sign an agreement with Russia, tomorrow Russia will not use this agreement to extract grants from you. So what should happen now? For democracies, we could expect more cooperation because they have to look at public goods argument, which is highly important for them. Autocracies, first of all, ignore public goods or look at them to a lower extent than democracies. That means they care only about private goods, and that means the private good benefit should be really enormous from the agreement to comply. And they are much more concerned about political dependence. Why? Because the risks for losing office are much higher. And because the risks are so high, you may be unwilling to commit to an agreement which increases your exit costs. Thus, while for democracies we should expect the higher level of cooperation, and this is precisely what the standard integration theory tells us, for autocracies we should expect lower level of cooperation in this case. And there may be one more reason why autocracies may be unwilling to cooperate here. Private gains in case of high interdependence can actually be extracted from breaking this independence as well. To give you a simple example, Kazakhstan put a lot of money into creating electricity networks surrounding, going away from Russia, making it independent from Russia. Not because it was economically efficient, but because it increased its independence from Russia, and it created enormous financial gains, because as soon as you implement a big infrastructural project, you earn from that. So private rents may actually be here on the side of non-compliance. While in our democracies, where the most important thing is public goods, compliance should happen. So high economic interdependence, we may expect compliance from democracies, but we should expect no compliance from non-democracies. And finally, what happens at the intermediate level? An intermediate level is a level where, on the one hand, gains from public and private goods are large enough, but on the other hand, need to reduce political dependence is not so high. So the exit costs are not enormous. And here, actually, we may see the only combination when autocracies will be complying with the agreements. So they are not here yet. So the costs of being dependent on your partner are not too high, not prohibitive. But they are not here already, meaning you get something from cooperating with your partner. So direct costs of implementation are not prohibitively high. This, by the way, would imply that in order to cooperate, if the autocratic countries have very high economic interdependence or unilateral dependence, this interdependence or dependence should go down. And only then cooperation could happen. And in fact, the post-Soviet case will fit this argument very well, as I will try to show in a second. In this case, they will still be somewhat more willing to cooperate in case their regimes are more or less stable, so they have concerns about external intervention or something like this. So the hypotheses are quite straightforward. Autocracies are unlikely to cooperate for high level of interdependence and for low level of interdependence, with the exception of the patron-client relations and direct power relations. But for autocracies, we should expect patron-client relations to be time inconsistent. As soon as you sign the agreement, if your goal was to strengthen your power, and then over time you achieve this goal, you don't need your patron anymore. I told you Tajikistan was a perfect example of patron-client relations, the perfect example of how they are non-credible over time. As soon as Tajikistani regime became a little bit more stable, what it did in the first place, kicked the Russian investors out of the country. And they had quite massive financial involvement in Rogun power plant reconstruction. We could talk about that later. And today, Tajikistan is actually, again, a reluctant country to join the customs union. Much more reluctant than, say, Kyrgyzstan or other countries, much more reluctant than you would expect from somebody being one of the closest Russian allies over the whole period. So these are the hypotheses. Let's look how they work out in the post-Soviet case. And for that, just two additional remarks. First of all, I think in this room, I don't have to say it, speak it out, but let it be here just at the beginning. All these countries start with enormous level of interdependence, much higher than you would expect even from parts of individual countries in other parts of the world. So Soviet republics were much closer tied to each other than, say, Chinese provinces. They have strong technological ties. The case of Ivanovo in textiles is quite a good example here. They have all the same infrastructure. And at least in the 1990s, they have serious concerns about whether they're going to stay independent at all, because many of them have some sort of retentionist movements, Russian minorities being concerned about their future in an independent state and potentially willing or not willing to secede or to cooperate with Russia. So I'm going to look at two cases. The first case is the cooperation of three countries, Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan. That's the main case, because it's the more interesting one. And here the driving force will be a Russia-Kazakhstan cooperation. And then there will be a boring case of Russia-Belarus, which, however, I have to produce here just for completeness. So let's come to the interesting case, Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan. This is just a short timeline of how cooperation happened among these countries. 1995, the first customs union is signed. Originally by Russia and Belarus, just a week later, or 2 weeks later, Kazakhstan joins. Over time, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan join. The only thing which this customs union actually manages to achieve until 1998 is a limited free trade area, which is more functioning because the countries unilaterally adjust their tariffs and impose zero tariffs on the cross-border trade, rather than real compliance with the regional integration here. In 1998, the crisis hits post-Soviet space. Russian ruble devaluates, and almost immediately after that, all of these countries create high protectionist barriers. Kazakhstan creates barriers against Russian imports. Russia has to deal with Belarus, which becomes a free channel of imports from the EU. The customs borders are again recreated at the borders between these countries, and it's actually not clear. I have talked to many trying to understand whether there was actually a period without customs borders between them for a longer period of time. Not clear. Some say that it has never been the case. And Kyrgyzstan, by the way, joins the WTO, so cooperation is basically to square one. In 2000, the customs union is transformed into Eurasian Economic Community, again with the same goals, and again with the same outcome. So at the next 8 years, or even 10 years, negotiations continue with almost no progress in terms of harmonizing the common tariffs, in terms of abolishing custom borders. Nothing happens. And then all of a sudden, in 2010, the countries again come together. Now only the group of three original members, Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, and create the new customs union, which is surprisingly to everybody who worked on the post-Soviet space, works. It works in three senses. First of all, it creates a common external tariff which all countries comply with, in spite of the need of relatively large adjustments. Kazakhstan had to increase its tariffs quite massively after joining the customs union. It does abolish internal customs borders, thus massively simplifying internal trade. And the most recent addition, it creates a functional supranational agency, which is actually deciding on trade issues, which is the Eurasian Economic Commission, which originally operated, no, not Commission itself, its predecessor, Commission of Customs Union, operated based on the weighted majority voting. Now it has the simple majority and de facto consensus rule. But anyway, what we see now is that in many cases, national lobbyists in Russia and in Kazakhstan don't have to go to their domestic government. They have to go to Eurasian Economic Commission if they want to achieve something, what becomes much more difficult. And finally, the most recent addition, the Common Economic Space, should create preconditions for capital and labor market liberalization. So you talk for a long time, nothing happens, and then all of a sudden, everybody starts complying with it. So how does it fit the story I was telling here? Well, first of all, as I said, there are three countries which we look at here, but only two matter, Russia and Kazakhstan. The customs union was created as a cooperation of these two members. Belarus, from the very beginning, didn't want to join. And in fact, even after the customs union agreement was in effect, tried to do exactly the same what it did all the time. It tried to, well, it tried not to comply. It was in summer 2010, and at that moment the decision was made by Russia and Kazakhstan to proceed without Belarus, and only after that Belarus complied. And in fact complied under heavy pressure of Russia. So Belarus is a simple story here, but we have to explain why these two countries to cooperate. Also other potential members, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Armenia now are also simple stories. These are either direct pressure cases like Kyrgyzstan, which simply has no choice because of the transition role between China and Central Asia. We could talk about that in the questions again. Or were, well, bought to some extent, like Armenia was. But Russia and Kazakhstan is interesting. What happens to Kazakhstan during this period? Kazakhstan starts as a country enormously integrated in the post-Soviet economy, having Russia as the main trade partner, exporting energy only through Russian territory, and having big Russian minorities in the north, which it had to deal with. And over the last 2 decades, it gradually reduced this dependence. So it created internal domestic infrastructure, limiting the need to trade through Russia and with Russia. The trade ties declined quite dramatically. In fact, you can see it here. This is the dynamic of trade ties, the share of exports to the customs union countries for Kazakhstan and for Belarus. And you see for Kazakhstan, this is this darker blue line. It's just going down quite massively. For Belarus, it stays roughly the same. It's different for imports. Imports remain relatively high for Kazakhstan, which are coming from the customs union. But still, the dependence obviously became lower. And as of now, if you look at empirical evidence, Kazakhstan is in fact among the countries in the post-Soviet space which are least dependent on the trade ties with their neighbors. By the way, the least dependent country of them all is Russian Federation, which has very low share of trade with the post-Soviet neighbors and mostly is tied to Europe. And Kazakhstan successfully creates new pipeline roads, and it pacifies remaining Russian minorities. So what was a big problem 20 years ago doesn't seem to be a big problem today. Summing up, Kazakhstan moves from the case of high interdependence to intermediate interdependence. Why intermediate and why not low one? Well, because there are still things which Kazakhstan could get from the customs agreement, and particularly access to the infrastructure. One of the major topics which is discussed in the CU all the time is railroad tariffs. Tariffs for accessing Russian railroads for Kazakhstani goods. In fact, if we look at what's happening with the Kazakhstan-Russian agreement in terms of actual economic ties, in terms of effects of the customs union, this would fit almost precisely the story I have told you now. Okay, the customs union was about creating a common tariff and about removing barriers for internal trade. And one of the major concerns which was expressed in the literature, there have been a number of studies, also by the World Bank, which looked at that, was it should lead to trade diversion. There should be much more trade happening with less productive Russian partners than with more productive external regional partners, particularly because Kazakhstan in the late 2000s experienced another major growing trade to China. And in fact, China is now, I think in terms of imports, it's superseded Russia as the economic partner of Kazakhstan. So at this moment of time, the threat was really about this trade diversion effects. What did happen? We have, unfortunately, very little evidence on what actually happened, because the first thing which customs union did was to destroy the trade statistics. We have no reliable information how much the trade between countries is. But for most studies which I have seen, and for also some which I have done, it looks like the trade effects are negligibly small, which is exactly what you would expect in case of this intermediate interdependence case. The costs, the direct costs of redistribution, which were associated with changing trade flows, are not so large. On the other hand, Kazakhstan is gaining, or at least seems to be gaining, in terms of other issues. One very good example for me is the inflow of FDI. Kazakhstan has a much more favorable tax regime than Russia, and it has been a lot of discussion that Russian companies are relocating to Kazakhstan for tax purposes. Again, very little data on that, but there is some, at least anecdotal evidence that it does seem to happen. So Kazakhstan gets something and has to pay not so much because it's not so dependent on Russia anymore. And that's why it can afford to comply. Again, from what I told you, you should expect Kazakhstan being willing to comply only up to a certain limit, right? Because if you comply too much, then you can get into high interdependence case. Trade increases, and then you don't want to comply anymore. And that's exactly what's happening. From the very beginning, you have a collection of at least 5 to 10 statements of Nazarbayev, repeated every time when customs union is discussed. We don't want a political union in any form. We don't consider economic integration above the level which we will achieve in the common economic space. This is what we want to have. We're happy to have this level of cooperation. Subsequent cooperation is, in our opinion, inefficient. And all the time when there were discussions of more drastic, more general reforms, Kazakhstan is calling for cautious approach. All right. So this is the case of Russia, Kazakhstan, Belarus, which is basically supporting what at least partly supporting what we hypothesized. Having intermediate level of relations is precisely the reason why cooperation went on. So they had to disintegrate to come together. What about Russia and Belarus? Here the story is way easier. Discussion of integration starts from the very beginning. Already the Kabich government, the first one, is willing to go along with already the monetary union with Russia. It has been the goal all the time. 1996, you have a Commonwealth of Russia and Belarus. 1997, you have a Union of Russia and Belarus. 1998, you have a Union State of Russia and Belarus. And well, this is how the discussions go on all the time. And actually, something is really achieved. There is a free movement of people, and there is free trade area between these countries. But all the time, Belarus seems to be quite reluctant to comply with really crucial issues which it has agreed upon. For example, there is a free trade area, but there are very high local content requirements in Belarus, which basically preclude Russian companies to entering the market. There is free movement of people, but there is massive examples. There are massive examples of expropriation of Russian assets. The most recent one, just last year, the potassium war, when the joint venture between Russia and Belarus aimed at producing and at selling potassium at international markets was dissolved. And after Lukashenko was unhappy with that, he invited the CEO of this joint venture to Minsk, and on their way back arrested him. And it took quite some time until he was released to Russia into house arrest. And this is not, there are dozens of examples like this. And the same is happening with the customs union. Belarus, from the very beginning, was trying to avoid customs union and actually tried to get only one thing out of it, the reduction of Russian export duties for oil. Because Belarus is gaining from reselling Russian oil and petroleum project to Europe. Actually, that's exactly what was happening. Russia agreed to that to some extent. And this is really an amazing case. I think Russia-Belarus cooperation since 2010 is unique in international comparison. It is a functioning cooperation agreement which reduced the level of economic ties between countries because it was functioning. The first thing Belarus did, it took the ability to resell Russian oil to Europe and was very happy about that. So it was trading more with the EU because customs union was in effect. And 2013, Lukashenko says that he is willing to leave customs union if his demands this time again are not fulfilled. So what is the case of Belarus? Unlike Kazakhstan, Belarus is a case of extreme dependence on Russia. Its goods are literally uncompetitive and have no access not only to international markets, they are even uncompetitive in Russia. And from my discussions which I had and from what I have observed, what you very often see is that Belarus is really pushing its goods to the Russian public procurement or state-subsidized contracts in Russia. And actually, Belarusian companies are on the list of companies receiving Russian public subsidies. It is, of course, depending on Russian energy. This is trivial, so we don't have to say it. And dependence didn't decline over time so much as for Kazakhstan. Economic reforms are limited. Access to foreign markets is limited. And as a result, it is a high dependence case. And as high dependence case, the cooperation works only as direct pressure of Russia or as a search for patron-client relations. And what we observe in this interrelation is actually all the time the mix-up between these two scenarios. In 2011, one of the reasons why Belarus was so compliant with the customs union in the beginning, it had a major currency crisis. So you need support, then you agree to play along. As soon as the crisis is over, you stop cooperating. So all the time is the combination of these two factors. Maybe one more, which may have played a role in the 1990s. In the 1990s, Belarus seems to have at least some ambitions. Russia-Belarus integration may be based on some ambitions Lukashenko had in Russian domestic politics. At that moment of time, he was very active, and supposedly, if the integration went far enough, he could become a major player there as well. I don't know, and so far he actually believed in that, but that was a discussed point, and this may add a little bit to the reasons for the integration. But otherwise, as I said, it's just these two relatively straightforward and boring stories. So let me summarize what I was talking about. Basically, the central argument of the paper is that unlike democracies, where a higher level of economic dependence and interdependence facilitates cooperation, since there's a greater need for public goods production, for non-democracies, it is not the case. They do cooperate only in case the level of dependence is intermediate. So the risk of having very high exit costs is not high enough, but there is something to gain from it. And this tells us something about the customs union. Customs union will be sustainable only in case it will not go far enough. So the best thing for customs union to succeed is not to succeed further. What happens if the customs union has an increasing economic ties over time? What happens if it really works? Well, then we could expect to fall back to the rhetorical integration. In the paper, we also briefly talk about examples outside the post-Soviet space, and there we look at two quite pronounced cases of autocratic cooperation. One is Gulf Cooperation Council, the best known probably, the oldest one, which is in many instances very similar to customs union. It's actually a working cooperation in some areas, but not going too far, between countries which are not really dependent on each other economically. They're all selling oil to their extra-regional partners. Internal ties are very low, but that is the reason why it actually works. And we briefly talked about ALBA, which is the Venezuela-run proto-integration agreement, which is more similar to a Belarus-Russia case, being again an example of patron-client relations or forced cooperation. All right, thank you very much. I would be really delighted to have your comments, suggestions, and particularly criticisms.
Thank you. We invite time for questions, and rather than taking the first question, I'll simply point out that the country that is the most likely candidate to join the customs union is Ukraine, so you might have some questions about that. But please, somebody identify yourself. Thank you. Ben?
Hi, my name is Ben. I'm the Associate Director at CERES. I thought it was a really interesting paper. I found it, I think it has some really great points. I found it a little bit problematic in one particular way, and that is that it seems to treat these autocratic governments as monoliths. Within the autocratic governments, they are of course not, and these governments are balances, shifting balances constantly of different interests. The paper might pay a little bit more attention, therefore, to the roles of institutions, the bureaucracies themselves. By looking at the vested interests in the bureaucracies, I think you can see a lot of the, it can reveal a lot of nuances, in particular why free trade, the benefits of free trade are often between countries, and I'm thinking in particular the Central Asian cases are often ignored. The power of the customs police in these countries is fairly substantial. The reasons why a lot of the previous agreements were ignored and even now in Kazakhstan are selectively enforced has a lot to do with the roles of these institutions. And therefore, by looking at taking an institutional view of these governments and of the vested interests in them, for example, in the Belarus Russian case could also be a good example, where you have private interests basically competing with each other and with overriding national interests in integration, or in the lack thereof, in the Ukrainian case. You can avoid giving artificial coherence to the actual roles of what's happening in between countries. Very often these agreements aren't as coherent or certainly in their implementation aren't as coherent as they might be portrayed as. You'll have part of your bureaucracy fulfilling the agreements and part of the bureaucracy not.
You want me to answer right away? Actually, this is a really great point. Let me give you 3 answers to that. The first one, yeah, absolutely. I agree with you that one of the levels of non-compliance is here precisely the non-compliance of street and medium-level bureaucracy, and also of individual agencies. The interesting story about post-Soviet case is that you had a much higher level of non-compliance. You had a level of non-compliance of the political leadership itself. And this is precisely what the paper tried to address, why the political leadership is not complying or complying in the first place. I understand I need to articulate it much clearer. Because it's not trivial at all, right? And there was a nice statement, I think, by Emomali Rahman, why should I comply with the agreement if I cannot comply with that? Okay, so this is the first point. The second point, I think that the lack of internal cohesion is in all of these countries actually going down over time. It is something what mattered a lot in the 1990s. And indeed, in the 1990s, there were accidents when the agreement was signed, and then just one private company said, I don't care. The best example is the early Caspian Sea Treaty, which, as you may remember, collapsed because Azerbaijan started drilling oil with support of Russian Lukoil, although Russia backed the treaty. But over time, all 3 countries I'm looking at here became much more monolithic and much more controlled, which is, at least as it seems to me the case, one of the reasons why they became much more willing to open their negotiations in the customs union, because now the threat of this enormous reaction of bureaucracies, of individual interest groups, became lower. Today, just non-complying with what Putin says is less likely, at least at the ministerial level or at higher level. Of course, at the customs level, everything can happen, but this cannot be the reason for these major changes. The third point, I actually have a paper about bureaucracies exactly, which is published already, which was one of the reasons I didn't talk about it. There is, of course, the side of the supranational bureaucracy. And one of the problems the post-Soviet regionalism faced in the past is supranational bureaucracy, which is supposed to encourage regionalism, was not encouraging it at all. Precisely for the reasons you discussed. Many of them had the second arm or the second foot in the domestic bureaucracy, in the domestic offices, and they could extract rent from non-complying, from manipulating the agreements and so on. This is just a small advertisement, if I may. The reason why I didn't talk about this in this very paper. That's a very important point. I agree with you entirely.
I'm opposed, so I would like to ask about Ukraine, but
okay.
not directly.
Mm-hmm.
In the beginning of the presentation, the current situation is, especially in the capital, changing all the time, right? So Ukraine was being proposed to join, and so on and so on. But I would like to ask about the political impact of such union, right? Because we know that Azerbaijan, after the current situation in Crimea, Azerbaijan has been very, let's say, opposite to Putin. There is no any single message from Lukashenko.
Yeah.
And I would like to ask you if you can find in the future that will be more and more problematic to make such research about current situation between these 2 countries.
Okay, are you talking about constraints for research or constraints about or changes in the conclusions?
Research, because right now, probably in the end, some of that political implementation of future custody can be very, very problematic.
I see. Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. In fact, when I was starting the presentation, I was thinking about saying maybe in 6 months we don't have a customs union at all. And actually what I was talking about here is precisely the case in point. As you remember, one of the arguments why Kazakhstan was ready to join is that it believed the problem of Russian minorities to be solved. If you believe the problem of Russian minority is not to be solved, the optimal strategy is a very different one. It is exactly rhetorical cooperation. You sign all the agreements, keep Russia happy, but keep Russia out. Obviously, and well, the Crimean case shows that the problem is not resolved, at least in the eyes of Russia. The problem is, of course, customs union went more and advanced more than previous agreements. So I don't know whether we should really expect Kazakhstan backing off of, say, Eurasian Economic Commission. But if, and actually we don't know how the Crimean case will resolve anyway, and we don't know what we'll hear today after we switch the laptops after this presentation and read the new news. So it's very hard to make any predictions. But it will certainly make Kazakhstan way more reluctant to cooperate in the customs union. That's for sure.
And financial key for the Russian economy, because we've seen the stock went up and dramatically down, you know, after.
Well, the customs union, as I said, has very little impact on the macro scale. I think in all the problems Russia is facing today, the possible non-compliance of Kazakhstan is the lowest one. The effect for Kazakhstan may be more interesting. One thing which could come immediately to my mind, by the way, also going a little bit in your line, maybe the enforcement of restrictions of trade with China will be much more selective. But what the consequences for Russia will be, we need to have a quantitative assessment of that, which is very hard to get. So I'm not sure whether I can really make the statement. My guess would be not so large, but I may be wrong here.
Thanks very much for your talk. It's very interesting. I'm Kelly Moriarty. I'm the Master of Science in Foreign Service program. I wanted to ask sort of a two-part question. One, so you suggest that customs union will continue to function if it doesn't function too well. So assuming that it stays in existence, I'd be curious to your thoughts whether you think it will continue to stay in the middle. The other question would be, from the perspective of companies outside of the who are trying to go in, what are some of the major implications that you would see for of this structure? If you're looking to it, you know, as it operates in the future, are there particular major risks that you would see for non-Russian, non-customs union companies that are trying to go in?
In terms of the first question, discounting all the political risks which we're observing now, I was actually expecting the customs union to stay relatively stable in the at least medium run, assuming the regime stays stable, oil price doesn't drop too much, nothing external, nothing happens domestically. Nazarbayev stays alive. It's a big question for all of these regimes. And he is in his 70s for sure. Yeah. So it is something that will change everything as soon as he is dead. That's for sure.
Remember, Soviet now the fifth generation don't make it to 60 on average.
But once they make it to 65, then you make it to 85.
Yeah. Let's see. But if those things don't happen, my expectation was it will stay relatively stable at the current level. It won't go much further. It will go much less. But what is there will function. And actually, my first assessment was it is a very good thing that it will function because, among other things, having a supranational authority to deal with is a very good lesson, so to say, for bureaucracies of all of these countries who need to cooperate and to negotiate with each other. But what will happen now, I don't know. In terms of risks for foreign companies, which companies do you have in mind here? Because China would look here very differently from Europe, from the US.
I mean, I'm thinking from the perspective of US companies.
Okay. I think the risks are relatively small. What customs union did, customs union increased the customs barriers for Kazakhstan. That indeed did happen. The major country which was affected by that was China. The effect on other countries, there was, for example, discussion about electronics imports from the EU. But the effect was, to my understanding, lower. For those who do business with Russia or with Belarus, nothing changed so much. I should make one remark here, probably, before, so that I don't give a wrong impression. There is a paper by Mukerchan, who is, I think, at the European University Institute, you know that, who is arguing that the increase of customs duties for Kazakhstan is not a unilateral Russian threat. It is rather what you should have given the negotiations. So all parties represented there rather equally. But whatever the reason for this increase is, there was an increase. As for the gains in terms of customs territory, for those who did business in Kazakhstan, therefore surely are there because you can access Russian market. For those who did business in Russia, I don't think anything changed a lot.
The one exception, I think, that Export-Import Bank may well be far less likely to support American firms doing anything in Russia, which would be good for the Europeans.
Maybe, at least in Germany, I wouldn't expect that the KfW would, or any German development authority would change anything because of that. But the attitude of the EU to the customs union was very clear. It's treated as non-existent. There is no customs union. There's nothing to talk about. We don't care.
Yes. Captain Gelkit, U.S. Foreign Money Officer. So the question I have is there any indication that within the Kazakh belief there was any support for the customs union beyond the immediate sort of Nazarbayev? I mean, obviously, the question of succession kind of looms large here, but that is a significant consideration. Do we think that other powerful players have vested interests here as far as support for the customs union?
I would not see the customs union as a unilateral Nazarbayev decision. You see it sometimes. It's just he who decided, everybody else rejected. First of all, Kazakhstani elites are not that split, right? So why should we expect there to be a significant opposition to that? Second, I think there are certainly groups in Kazakhstan which were opposing to customs union. But as I said in my presentation, the costs are relatively low. So it may be just something what they didn't really care about or were concerned about that much. Also, it depends upon who benefits from economically. And one thing which was said about Kazakhstan and also confirmed by Kazakhstani businesses, small business was very concerned about the customs union. But big companies actually expected to gain from that, precisely because of access to Russian infrastructure. And we know that a lot of big business in Kazakhstan has political circles behind that. And these may be very much in favor of it. So I don't know. I wouldn't see the Kazakh customs union as the issue which split everybody in Kazakhstan. Probably even to a lower extent than it looks from the media.
One of the questions that had come up prior to the recent events in Ukraine was Ukraine joining the customs union. And some people even suggested that the $15 billion economic support package was kind of a bribe to convince them join the customs union, not do the partnership agreement with you. What are the chances for that now?
Zero. I think there were zero before now as well. Ukraine did not want to join customs union under no pretext. Yanukovych government would never join customs union as well. I would rather see this $15 billion as a bribe of not to join the association agreement, which Russia was very much concerned about. And I should also say there were economic rationales behind this concern. So let's be frank with it. But joining customs union, it was clear it will never happen, precisely because of its supranational nature.
And one other Ukraine focus in terms of customs union versus the partnership. One of my colleagues who works for the U.S. government said that he talked to several of the Ukrainian oligarchs, and one of them said that he had run the numbers for what would happen to his business joining the Eurasian Union, having a partnership in Europe. He said that if they joined the Eurasian Union, they would get a 2- or 3-fold increase. If they joined the EU, they would get a 6- to 8-fold increase.
I wouldn't be surprised at all, because Ukrainian oligarchs are basically the major backers of European integration in Ukraine. For obvious reasons, Ukrainian oligarchs, Eastern oligarchs, by the way, are those who benefit from the ferrous metals exports. And Ukraine basically can export two things, ferrous metals and agriculture. I would be very surprised if the association agreement allowed Ukraine to export agriculture to European markets, because it's absolutely closed, as we know. But they will have at least better chance to export ferrous metals, which is something what oligarchs want. So they are absolutely in favor of it.
Which raises another question. Why wouldn't Russian oligarchs see this as a major opportunity?
Because nobody's signing an association agreement with Russia. It's signed with the Ukraine, right?
But they could still invest. They could use that as conduit. It would seem that their economic opportunities from a Ukraine tied to Europe are far greater than from a Ukraine tied to Russia.
For this to happen, what they need to do is really invest and purchase assets in Ukraine. First of all, Ukrainian metals industry is in terrible shape. Unlike Russian metals, which has received a lot of investments in the last decade, which was re-equipped and which is much more up to date, Ukrainian metals producers, ferrous metals producers in Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk, exactly there where they were 20 years ago. So there was nothing done, very little done. So this is a very costly investment. Second, is an investment which is not necessarily likely to happen because whether Ukraine is part of the association agreement or not, Ukraine remains Ukraine. There will be political interests of oligarchs protected at all levels, and therefore they will just not let Russian investors in and buy their assets. So I don't know. And we're talking, and in terms of everything else, well, Russia is not a major consumer goods exporter, right? It's either through Ukraine or through anything else. It has no chances to compete with high-tech products or with machine building on the European markets. It is an oil and gas exporter. It is a resource exporter. And here, the chances of association agreement are much smaller. What the association agreement would make is probably to let the much better access of European goods on Russian markets. Of course, there is, Anders Ostlund has a very good paper on that, where he emphasizes very clearly, there is the home origin principle, which should have prevented that. But we all know that Ukrainian bureaucracy is not the most efficient in the world. I could easily imagine the home origin rule be manipulated. Because this is what would happen to Russia. This is what Russia was concerned about. But I don't know. My personal point of view on that is that ideal scenario, which is gone probably, which will never happen now, would be some sort of economic cooperation involving all three parties, the customs union, the European Union, and Ukraine, finding a mutually beneficial agreement. This is actually what one of the books said, as you may have seen, but which would be probably a very difficult solution to find, but which would be possible to find. In fact, benefits of all the cooperation with the EU are not just about trade and investment. They are about importing institutions. And Russian business is not necessarily willing to operate in chaotic and lawless environment, at least not all of that. But now it's gone, or very likely gone.
The costs are going to be already pretty high.
Yeah.
Other questions? Ben, please.
I had a couple questions. One was something that occurred to me when you were speaking a little bit earlier to my points, and that is that maybe what you might add in this is a narrative of just state capacity building, because that would address this issue of internal cohesion. The point that you made that they're becoming more cohesive, certainly in Russia, but especially in places like Kazakhstan, where there's far more of an ability to affect, and that would sort of get rid of this bureaucracy not quite doing what it's supposed to do. And the other thing that I wanted to ask about was the effect on Kazakhstan's neighbors, particularly Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, of the customs union. In particular, in Kyrgyzstan, when it started enforcing the customs union, it really created a lot of disruptive trade in the northern part of the country. The meat market, trade in agricultural goods was haywire. There was a good deal of smuggling. They had to build a border fence, and I was wondering what the longer-term effects are going to be. Is this going to draw countries like Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan into the union, or is it going to have another effect that is kind of push them away?
The first point is just great. Thank you so much. In the older version of this paper, I had.
Is that you?
No. I had two dimensions of two external variables. One was interdependence, and another was regime consolidation. But state capacity is better. It is getting rid of many things which I was concerned here much better. So thanks a lot. This is great. In terms of the second point, I would distinguish between Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan. Kyrgyzstan had a very special economic model, which was very well described by Gael Rabalant and Bartolomei Kaminsky from the World Bank, who have a very good book about that. It is basically a country, an entrepot, as they call it, for Chinese consumer goods into Central Asia. So they came into Kyrgyzstan by a very easy access route, semi-smuggling, I would say, and then were resold everywhere else. After Kazakhstan joined customs union, it became impossible. And Kyrgyzstan actually was before a choice between two evils. Either you join the customs union, and then you cannot serve as an entrepot for Chinese goods because the border to China closes, or you don't join the customs union, and then you are serving as entrepot to nowhere because the border to Kazakhstan closes. And actually, there were, a couple of years ago, I got a chance to listen to a couple of presentations about Dordoy market in Bishkek and about the reaction of Dordoy traders on customs union. For them, it came as a shock. They had to throw away the goods at the borders because all of a sudden they couldn't export them further. But you have a choice between two evils. So what should you do? Actually, you should wait who's going to compensate you, at least partly. And the customs union seemed to be willing to compensate. And that was the reason why Kyrgyzstan decided to finally join the customs union, though it is, of course, an imperfect option for the country. But it simply had no other choice. For Uzbekistan, Uzbekistan is, first of all, much more self-sustaining than Kyrgyzstan. Its dependence on cotton is gone. Cotton now makes a relatively small share of its export, although the question is how well the data on export are for Uzbekistan. It's a debatable point. It isn't a major energy exporter, but it has at least something what will let it sustainable. So I would say for Uzbekistan, nothing will change. It will never join customs union, at least as long as you don't agree?
No, I completely.
Okay. As long as another major parameter stays the same, which is the president. It's outside of the option. The candidates for customs union are Kyrgyzstan, for the reasons I said, and Tajikistan, which is very willing to benefit from the common economic space framework, that is the free migration to Russia.
It's not a crucial point. If cotton is no longer so important to Uzbekistan, why are they still having all these people and children going out?
When I said it's not so important, it makes a lower share of foreign trade. It doesn't mean that it disappeared entirely economically. And also the question is, I think, from what I know about Uzbekistan, could easily imagine the question being some sort of preventing de facto unemployment or solving the problem of de facto unemployment.
Because this is the Nakartoshku routine again.
Yeah, but that's exactly why Nakartoshku was done in the Soviet Union, so that people kind of work. And in modern Uzbekistan, it may be even more important because it is an economy which is still a central planned one. It's not a market economy.
Anyone else?
My understanding is that Armenia was working on joining the customs
Mm-hmm.
and if that is still in progress, how does that sort of fit into your model here? Do you see any benefits for them?
Armenia fits in the model very well. This is exactly the case of semi-coerced. So Armenia was more or less receiving large benefits from Russia in exchange for joining. And that's why I decided to join. It is a small country which is economically tied to Russia more than to other countries, primarily because of political situation, right? It's having Azerbaijan and Turkey as its neighbors, and it simply had no other choice. And at some point of time, as you remember, it just reversed its decision to more actively cooperate with the EU and declared their willingness to join the customs union. So it is exactly the boring case, but even to more extent and to quite extent in Belarus.
What's fascinating is that even when Putin and Lavrov talk about the customs union, they don't mention Armenia.
It's not member yet. The negotiations are going on, and there are already assessments, and there is work going on into harmonizing the legislation, because, as I said, customs union is not just a fake agreement as all of them before. You really need to do something to join it. But they are not there yet.
Anyone else? If not, thank you very much.
Thank you.
For the time to be with us today.
Thank you. Great comments. I really appreciate it. Thanks a lot.